Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by David French. He's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I much appreciate it.
So we want to know a little bit about the man behind the senior fellowship at National Review Institute. Where did you get started in this whole fighting for First Amendment rights?
I really got started at law school. I founded a group called the Society for Law, Life, and Religion at Harvard Law School. It was one of the first pro-life religious liberty groups at the school. Now, in full disclosure, whenever you found a student group, if any of the viewers are wanting to found a student group, think of the acronym. So Society for Law, Life, and Religion for the next 20 years at Harvard Law School was pronounced slur, which is not great branding. But I started in law school, so I founded a pro-life group, religious liberty group, worked on my first pro bono case, assisting as a student intern back in law school, and then continued doing First Amendment litigation throughout the rest of my legal career.
So how was your slurring responded to by the university, by the student body? Was it controversial?
Oh, you could say that. So at the time, the administration was fine with it. I mean, there were no problems from the administration, but one of the things that was happening at the law school at that time is very similar to what you see on campuses today, where the students are trying to censor people, the students are trying to shut people up. And so this was in the age of the early 1990s, where of the age of the shout down, when people would boo and hiss and yell at you to drown you out when you spoke up in class. And then when we tried to distribute literature, arguing for the pro-life perspective, sometimes it came back to me in my box in the form of, I don't really call them death threats. They were more like death aspirations. Words like, why don't you go die? In other words, things that, they weren't saying I'm going to kill you, but I hope somebody does.
Well, but you had the choice to live and you took it. So
I took
thank you.
I took it, I did.
You lived with trauma around you because of your political views. But I'm curious, just on a personal level, what drove you to start that organization in the first place?
Well, there was a vacuum. I mean, it's one of the largest, if not one of the top 3 largest law schools in the country. We didn't have a real pro-life group there. The Federalist Society was very small at that time. It wasn't the mighty juggernaut that it is today. And so there was just a vacuum. There wasn't a distinct pro-life voice on campus, so we wanted to form it. We also wanted to emphasize religious liberty, and that's what we did.
Okay. And so moving past that, you practiced law for a while?
A long time, yeah. So I practiced law full-time as a litigator, also taught law school, was in the Army Reserve as a JAG officer. So I did a lot of different things in the law, but I practiced law full-time for 21 years until I came to National Review full-time in 2015.
And did you stay in the pro-life section? Talk to us about the kinds of cases you covered.
So I started off as a commercial litigator in a big law firm, and I would do pro bono First Amendment cases on the side. And then after a while, after several years, I had so much pro bono First Amendment work that I really had to decide, was I going to be a commercial lawyer with this First Amendment hobby, or was I just going to dive in and do First Amendment work full time? And so I chose to leave commercial litigation, started doing First Amendment work full time, and worked for nonprofits like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education and Alliance Defending Freedom, and eventually got to the point where I was running a litigation group that was filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit against major universities across the country that were violating students' First Amendment rights.
And were there any cases that were particularly notable that would have been out in the public that you can kind of show us your fingerprints upon?
Well, I mean, there were a number of cases striking down speech codes at campuses from coast to coast, protecting the rights of religious student groups to form and operate on campus. But one of my favorite cases was one of my last cases, and this was a jury trial that I had in North Carolina, where I believe we won the first jury case holding that a conservative professor had been denied a promotion because of his political point of view. And that was the case with actually a guy who was a former townhall.com, currently Daily Wire columnist named Mike Adams, who was a criminology sociology professor at UNC Wilmington, and had a week-long jury trial. That went very well, thankfully. And after that happened, I thought, maybe I need to exit the practice of law on a high note. Right. And then that's when I started working at National Review.
And so how long ago was that?
So that Verdict was in 2014.
Okay.
And started working at National Review at 2015. But I'd been writing for National Review on these issues for many years before then.
And do you think that things are trending in the direction of more or less free speech on campus after you've left?
So I'll put it this way. The trends for preventing college administrators from censoring students are very positive. The number of speech codes is going down. It's becoming harder and harder to find these really egregious cases where campus administrators silence students or kick student groups off campus. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but we've gone from a very target-rich environment to one in which it's a little bit more rare to see the excesses. But here's what's happened that's really negative. Now the censorship impulse comes from the grassroots up. It is students who are trying to block speakers, trying to shout down speakers, sometimes threatening speakers. And that, hopefully that peaked in the 2015, 2016, 2017 cycle, where we saw, for example, riots at Berkeley. We saw students try to attack Charles Murray at Middlebury College. We saw multiple events shut down, threats of violence against Ben Shapiro, for example. Mm-hmm. We haven't seen that as much so far in the 2018 cycle, but that really put a chilling effect on free speech, because people, it's one thing to confront an administrator who's wanting to punish you. It's another thing entirely when the student body, there are people in the student body who seem to be actually interested in threatening you or shouting you down or blocking you from speaking.
I'm curious, because as we're talking about this and we're seeing how this is happening at the universities, we see the same thing in culture at large.
Oh, totally.
We see it on social media. We see it out in the wild, not just in political arenas, but, well, it ends up, a lot of it's politically tied.
Yeah.
People trying to decimate businesses for people's beliefs or what have you. How are you looking at that trend, and are you going to see more? Do we expect to see more of that as well?
So that's bad, and it's getting worse.
Right.
So I would say what's happening on campus was very dramatic because you had these violent incidents. Mm-hmm. What's happening in the wider culture, you're not seeing as many of the violent incidents, but you're seeing people lose their jobs. You're seeing businesses, economic boycotts on businesses. You're seeing major corporations that are so intimidated by their internal mob, what I call their internal mob, their own employees who will unite to expel the heretic, so to speak, right, that it's just getting worse. And I don't see it getting better soon. I do think that we'll reach a point in time where we're going to look back on this and say, what were we thinking? This is embarrassing. This was ridiculous. Right. But we're not there yet, and I fear that it's going to have to get worse before it gets better.
Do you think as a society, as a country, we understand what First Amendment protections are all about anymore?
No. There's a lot of polling out there right now that essentially says that a whole lot of people, or particularly young people, they love free speech, but they essentially define free speech as good speech that I like.
Right.
And they hate speech. And hate speech they essentially define as any speech that offends another person on the basis of certain protected characteristics.
Right.
And so that's not the way the First Amendment works. There is no concept called hate speech that has lesser protection under the First Amendment. And the definitions of hate speech that are being used, and another phrase that you will hear all the time now, is dehumanizing speech. So there's not just hate speech, there's dehumanizing speech, which is, again, speech that tends to offend people on the basis of certain characteristics. What's happening is people are beginning to say that there is no room in the larger body politic, no room in our community for the kind of speech that offends me. And so they're going to say, with a straight face, if you put them on a lie detector test, they would say, I am totally for free speech. But they just don't consider this speech that they find offensive to fit within the definition of free speech, that it's something else entirely. And then as you have a culture that often privileges and empowers people who can adopt victim status, the incentive to expand this category of speech that is hate speech is overwhelming. So essentially, these exceptions to the culture of free speech start to swallow the rule that, so long as a certain majority group of people are in power in any given institution, whatever that majority finds offensive, they will end up silencing or censoring.
Is there a road back?
There's always a road back. I mean, there's always a road back. There was a road back at Harvard Law School. So when I was there in the early 90s, as I said, this was the age of the shout down. This was the age of the booing and the hissing. And eventually it just went too far. It went too far. There was an article in, I believe it was GQ magazine back in the early 90s that called...
A bastion of intellect.
A bastion. But a lot of people read it,
right.
And it was called, I believe, Beirut on the Charles. So this is when Beirut, Lebanon was every bit as violent as, say, Fallujah, Iraq is now. And it called it Beirut on the Charles, and it profiled a lot of these student activists who were whipping up a lot of this fervor and frenzy, and they didn't come across so well. And it kind of gave the school a black eye. And by the time my third year ended, I could see that we were cycling out of that culture. And then by the time a new dean came, and this is kind of interesting given who she is now, Elena Kagan. Elena Kagan came, and she set a completely new tone. She would sit there and say things like, I love the Federalist Society. She would go to Federalist Society meetings. She actively recruited conservative faculty, not just conservative, but get this, conservative Christian faculty to the law school. It turned the page, it really did.
And now she eats them on weekends, right? Is that how that...
Well, it's funny because when she was nominated, there were a lot of conservatives, especially young lawyers, who went to the law school when she was the dean and had such an appreciation for the climate that she set that they did not come out strongly against her at all, even though she's unabashedly progressive. And the interesting thing about her is we speak of a liberal bloc of 4. And on a lot of issues, there is a liberal bloc of 4 on the court. But she's part of a sub-block of 2 with Justice Breyer that will sometimes depart from Sotomayor and Ginsburg. She has ruled, for example, in contentious free speech cases for, I won't call it the conservative position, I'll call it more the free speech position more than a few times.
And that's refreshing, that people do sometimes break out of their progressive or conservative labels to really look at common sense and really what is the right thing to do versus what's the politically charged way to do things.
Right. Well, and if you look at the Supreme Court, the 5-4 decision is common for a lot of the more notorious cases. But if you look at the Supreme Court jurisprudence as a whole, including First Amendment jurisprudence as a whole, it doesn't break down 5-4 all the time, not even necessarily most of the time. So a lot of these things are a little bit more nuanced than we're led to believe.
Well, I think that's with everything.
Right.
Right? We want to see our side win. We want to be able to point fingers at who's a barrier to getting our agenda done.
Sure.
But so we highlight that versus look at the times when we get together, because it doesn't sell as well to not have the division or the appearance of divisiveness happening out in the culture at large, right? We talked about midterm elections and how things broke down a little differently than they might have a couple of years back as far as red states and blue states and people, we didn't talk about this specifically, but Republicans getting hit by the Trump Act or other things because they were associated. What do you think of the elections that just passed? Is there a referendum that's happening? Is this a normal balancing?
Yeah, so 3 things. All right, and I'll try to remember all 3.
If I get to 1.5 and feel like you've lost them, 1.5, I'll try to drag you back.
Great. First, I do think that the midterms are more dangerous for Republicans than they thought in the first 24 to 48 hours after. The first 24 to 48 hours, it looked as if you would have 54, maybe even 55 Republican senators, and it looked as if the gains in the House were more limited for their Democrats. Now it looks like the gains in the House are very robust for Democrats, maybe approaching 40. And it looks like we're going to max out, Republicans will max out at 53 senators rather than 54 or 55, depending on the results of this Florida recount. So number one, it looks worse for Republicans now, many more days later than it did in a day or two. Number two, what is apparent is the Republicans have a real problem in the suburbs. A real problem. And this is something that they're going to have to pay attention to for 2020. Now, Democrats can't get too happy about it because these are a lot of voters who are dispositionally Republican, have been Republican for a really long time. They don't like the current president. And this suburban showing has been really negative And it's not necessarily outweighed by the fact that rural and ex-urban voters are coming out more, because there's a lot of people who live in suburbia. So that's the second thing that's a real warning for Republicans. The third thing, and this is something people have not talked enough about, our states are dividing along red-blue lines more than any other time in recent memory. So if you look at the state legislative elections and the state gubernatorial elections, out of the 50 states in the U.S., there is only one legislature left that is divided, with one chamber Republican and one chamber Democrat. There are 18 states that are Democrat, both chambers. There are 31 states that are unified Republican. And the last state left that's split is Minnesota. And if you pull back even from there and you look at the states that have what are called trifectas, the governor and both chambers of Congress, of the state legislature, are unified, we're at a modern record. So we're going to have, I believe it is 37 more than that, 37 states that are trifectas. So that shows you that we are dividing as a nation very sharply, and even right down to the state level.
What do you think is driving that?
Three things: culture, culture, and culture. Culture is downstream, politics is downstream from culture, and a lot of our political combat now is really a proxy for a culture war. Let's take gun control, for example. Gun control is a hot topic in the aftermath of a lot of these mass shootings. If you look at any given gun control proposal and these common sense gun control measures, the net effect of them on gun crime, the net effect of them on mass shootings, for example, is inversely proportionate to the intensity of the argument. So you're talking about things that would have very little effect, if anything, but a very great level of intensity.
It's emotionally driven versus sensibly driven.
It's also essentially this: there is a population of Americans for whom gun culture is alien to them. Mm-hmm. It's not just that they want more gun control, they don't like people who own guns.
Right.
And there's a population of gun-owning Americans who not only is the Second Amendment important to them, but there's an entire culture of self-reliance that's built around that. And then they look at people, say, in these big urban coastal elite areas, and they literally think of them as weak. They literally think of them as helpless and dependent on the government. There's at the edges, there's a lot of contempt. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot of contempt flying in both directions, and that's just the gun issue.
Right.
Think about religious liberty. The religious liberty question, the intensity of the argument around the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, for example, where this one baker in Colorado said he didn't want to make a custom cake for a same-sex wedding, resulted in comparisons that if he won, we'd bring back Jim Crow, which is absurd.
Right.
Absurd. And so what you begin to have is a group of people who say that person, that baker, is a stand-in for a class of people that I despise.
That sounds like they're dehumanizing him.
That's a borderline hate speech. Borderline hate
Borderline.
Yeah, that's this phenomenon called negative polarization.
Right.
Negative polarization is when I am a Republican, say, not because I like Republican ideas, but because I despise Democrats. Or Democrats say I'm a Democrat, not because I like Democrat ideas, but because I despise Republicans. And that's the polarization we have today.
Wanting to be on the team that's in power, or just fighting against the ideology or assumed ideology.
Right. You're voting out of fear. You're voting out of loathing. Right now, about 80% of Republicans, 82% of Republicans have either an unfavorable or a very unfavorable view of Democrats. Mm-hmm. And about 78% of Democrats have either a very unfavorable or unfavorable view of Republicans. So what you're doing is you're voting out of this visceral distaste. Now, that's not to say that policies aren't important to you. You know, a Democrat may really want single payer, or a Republican may really want lower taxes. But what is the primary motivator? What's the thing that's right here as opposed to down here? For an awful lot of people, it's just beating the other side because they fear and despise the other side.
Right. And so this last election cycle was one where that emotion was obviously whipped up.
Yes.
In very extreme ways. And so help us understand the psyche, and if you saw the First Amendment limitations being thrown in there to help push things, or fear of loss of rights. What did you see as you were looking at the election?
Yeah, what I saw was a lot of people voting out of what they would perceive as self-defense. Mm-hmm. So there was this famous essay that circulated in Republican circles in 2016 that called the election the Flight 93 election. It was charge the cockpit or you're going to die, which was just a ridiculous exaggeration of the actual issues at stake. But people emotionally felt like that. I would be out there and I'd be talking to people, and they would look me in the eyes and they would say, if Hillary Clinton wins, America is over.
Right.
Over. And that, on the other side, the Democrats actually, it wasn't until after the election it really sunk in, because before the election, they just assumed they were winning.
Right.
But after the election, it's what you've seen today, the resistance and a lot of the excesses that we're seeing today.
What's interesting is you talk about that kind of, and I'll use the word fear-mongering. Mm-hmm. I tend to see it used more effectively from Democrat or from liberal perspectives usually, where there's the emotionally charged vote. The Republicans are going to stop your ability to get your abortion when you want to. They're going to force you to buy guns. They're going to do all of these things. Mm-hmm. And Republicans have traditionally taken a more libertarian approach. It's like, you know what, if I don't like something, I'm just not going to do it, mm-hmm. versus I'm going to pass a law to stop you from doing it. And so usually there's a clear-cut thing. But what you're talking about with that Flight 93 kind of thought process is the Republicans use that to get people to get out and vote for Trump, right?
Oh, completely.
And it worked for them. So that just goes to prove that some Republicans do have emotions, number one, but that as human animals, we tend to be driven by emotion and fear.
Absolutely. I mean, fear is a very, very powerful motivator. Now, the funny thing is, both sides, if you put a partisan from both sides on a lie detector, they would say, I use reason and logic, and the other side uses fear. I can't tell you the number of times I've had arguments and discussions with progressives, and they say, we're just arguing facts. Republicans argue fear. And Republicans will say, we argue facts, and they argue fear. The bottom line is, both sides use fear an awful lot. Now, sometimes it's important to raise an alarm, but we always raise the alarm so darn loud and sometimes so disproportionate to the actual threat that you don't even know what's truly dangerous anymore or not.
Right.
Because it all can't be dangerous. But that's the way we tend to treat our political discourse.
There are a lot of other questions I'd like to ask you, but we've only got about a minute left. I wanted to just find out if people want to track you and find out a little bit more about where they can find your thoughts. What's the best way for them to discover you?
I write almost every day on nationalreview.com.
Okay.
But if one piece a day is not enough for you, you can follow me on Twitter at David A. French, where you're going to get political musings, arguments about Star Wars, and the most knowledgeable NBA basketball opinions this side of the conservative world.
Okay. Well, just out of curiosity, Star Wars, is this military or is this Jedi?
Jedi, Sith, yes.
Excellent. Just so people can properly bucket you.
Yeah, exactly. The George Lucas world.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you very much for sharing a little bit about your opinion. If you hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Liberty Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And that was a word from our underwriters, the Liberty Forum, as you saw from the roll-in, formerly the Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley. What they're best known for, however, not just our show, even though we're in our 7th season, coming to the end of it, is their speaker series. And that was the reason we were able to get David on the show this evening. He'll be speaking later this evening around 7 o'clock at 432 Stearland Road here in Mountain View at the Liberty Forum. In December, Andrew Klavan, who's been on our show before, he's a pundit, an author, screenwriter, podcaster, funny guy, extremely bright. He'll be there in December. In January, Pete Peterson. He's the dean of the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. And there are more speakers coming that you'll be interested in if you go to the Conservative Forum, now Liberty Forum website. For more information. Just in closing, David and I just touched briefly on the whole set of topics that we could have touched on about freedom of speech, but also about whether or not emotion may be driving some of our political decisions or just the way we operate as a society. Have we lost respect for one another altogether? Do we realize that people are, if we speak to them as humans, there still could be a lot of common ground we could find, but we're too busy being polarized. So look David up, find out more about his thoughts and his opinions out there on the web. Look for David French, just like French people, the country. But in closing, have a great night. This has been The Right Side. I've been your host, Chris Pareja. And if you need to reach out to us, you can find us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, or we'll see you in person or on the show sometime soon. Thanks again and have a great night.